Okay, so now we're looking at some criticisms of Nozick, and first I want to start with what I take Rawls' response to Nozick would be. Okay, so think about this in terms of the Wilt Chamberlain example. So you remember how that works. Wilt, people freely pay 25 cents to Wilt, and as a result he ends up being incredibly rich. And Nozick says, my daughter's singing outside, maybe I'll just ask her to shush. I told her she'd be on YouTube if singing, and she immediately shut up and ran away. Anyway, what was I saying? Okay, yes, so people put the 25 cents, Wilt becomes rich, and Nozick says, where's the injustice? Everyone does this freely, there's no injustice. Now, Rawls' replies to this, I think, would be to say, yes, okay, so your position, Nozick, is that I can set up the society how I want, and then as a result of all these free transactions, Wilt will get rich. And so I can't object to Wilt's wealth. No, that's wrong, says Rawls, because when I set up my original conditions, I'm going to set up redistributive institutions as part of those initial conditions. And why am I going to do that? Well, because the difference principle justifies that. So when I set up my initial conditions, I'm going to set up, there are going to be redistributive institutions there. So as Wilt gets richer, some of his money will be taken away and redistributed. That's built in. You said I can start with any pattern I want. The pattern that I want to start with is a pattern that contains redistributive institutions. Okay, and for a long time I thought that was a knockdown argument against Nozick, but I don't think it is anymore. Actually, I'm not saying there's force in the argument. Rawls has got a point there that the argument actually comes from a guy called Will Kimlicka. That's one of the books that I in the recommended reading for this course. Will Kimlicka. He says this is how Rawls would respond, and I think it's good as far as it goes, but it doesn't go as far as you might think, because remember that. The real point that Nozick wants to bring out from all of this is that the only way that we can achieve equality is through constant coercion. And Nozick would say all you're doing, Rawls, is you're building coercion into your initial state. When you say you're going to build institutions, redistributive institutions into your initial state, you're just building coercion, and that's just their coercive institutions, and they are, right? They force people. Taxation isn't optional, but it's coercive, and so I think it doesn't really defeat this Rawlsian response. The Kimlicka's response doesn't really defeat Nozick's position. There are other problems with Nozick's argument, and indeed with the Wilt Chamberlain argument. Shapiro, for example, the writer of the text, or in the textbook, he argues that we might well be uncomfortable with the end result. So let's say, for example, in Shapiro's example, that Wilt becomes the owner of a company town. Now, the company towns are something that I don't think have ever existed in New Zealand, but they were commonish at a certain point in the United States. And this would be, a company, let's say, for example, a mining company might own a mine, and they need workers to work the mine. And so what they do is the company builds a town near the mine for the workers to live in. And in the town, the company owns the land, and they rent out the houses. They own the shops. The shops that sell food to the people who live in the town are owned by the company, and so on. Everything's owned by the company. And the problem with that is it becomes for these people's lives, the company becomes a huge monopoly. I mean, not just a monopoly on the mining, but a monopoly on everything, right? So they have to buy their food from the town. They have to buy their clothes from the town. They have to buy all their resources from the town. They have to rent their house from the town, from the company, right? They rent their clothes they buy their clothes from the company. They buy their food from the company. They rent their house from the company. They send their kids to a school that's run by the company. That's possible too. right? And you get the picture. The company has this enormous power over people's lives. And Nozick said, Shapiro says, even if you're happy about the people putting the 25 cents in the box, you might not be happy about the power that Wilt Chamberlain ends up with at the end of the day. For example, if he ended up owning a kind of company town or something of the kind. And what Shapiro is pointing out is, you might not object to the transactions, the putting the 25 cents in the box and the money being given to Wilt. You might not worry about that. But your problem might not be the transactions. Your problem might be the power that Wilt ends up accruing to himself. That might be the problem. And surely you can object to that power, right, without objecting to the transactions. You can say the transactions are all fine in themselves. The problem is that Wilt ends up with this unjustified amount of power. He has power over other people that he shouldn't have, like companies had over people in company towns. And that was, one of the things that people did in company towns actually is they made everything incredibly expensive, right? So, you would work in the mine, get paid a wage, and then all your wages would be used up buying food and paying the rent. And so in effect, the company got a free workforce. That was sort of the idea, right? Then you might think, well, it's this power that's the problem, right? Not the wealth per se, it's the power. And you can object to the power without objecting to the transactions. Okay, we'll come back to this. There's another criticism and this is, I don't think I've read this anywhere else. I think it's my criticism of Nozick. And I call it my Marxian or Marxist, Marxian because I don't think of myself as a Marxist at all, but my Marxian criticism of Nozick. It's Marxian because it's Marx, thinking about Marx, that made me realise that this was a problem with Nozick's view. Okay, so it's about the Wilt Chamberlain example. So let's go right to the beginning of the Wilt Chamberlain argument. How does it work? Wilt contracts with the Lakers that when people go to the games, they're going to pay the gate, but they're also going to put 25% in a box. Okay, so the whole thing gets set up with this contract that Wilt Chamberlain has with the Lakers. Okay, what are the Lakers? What is this thing, the Lakers? Well, they're a basketball team in the NBA, the National Basketball Association. Well, what is that? What are these things? What are the Lakers? What is the NBA? These things are corporations. And corporations don't exist in the state of nature. Okay, and this is something that is completely absent. The recognition of this is completely absent from Nozick's position. The Wilt Chamberlain example is set up by Wilt contracting with a corporation. And what's more, it's a corporation that belongs to a larger corporation. Okay, these things don't exist in the state of nature. There are no corporations in the state of nature. Now, why is this important? Well, one of the reasons that it's important is that Nozick smuggles in to his minimal state something that doesn't belong there, and that is corporations. You see, if we're really going to have a minimal state, that is a state where there's no redistribution and so on, maybe we shouldn't have corporations either. Corporations are created by government intervention in the free market. That's something that's really important to recognise. Corporations these days, there is a statute, and there's a procedure that you have to follow. And what you do is you create what we call in law legal persons. They are a non-natural person, something that isn't naturally a person, and they have legal personality. They're able to act in ways that a natural person can act. They have limited liability and so on. These things are creatures of the law. They are creations that aren't there in the state of nature. Okay, so what Nozick actually argues for is a state with a minimal government, but it's also a state with no corporations. That's the minimal state. Now, one reason that this is important is that if you actually imagined a world like that, right, a world in which there were no corporations, then no doubt Nozick's right that in a world like that there would be, through free transactions, inequality. But maybe that's an inequality that many of us could live with. I mean, one thing that makes Wilt so rich, and certainly actual professional basketball players these days are so incredibly rich is that they're paid huge sums of money to play basketball, let alone things like quarterbacks in American football, or football players in the English Premier League and so on. But they're paid this money by corporations, right? And what are corporations? Corporations are these legal entities that are conglomerations of power and wealth that can't exist without there being some interference in what we might call the free market, or what we should call in this context the state of nature. Now, in a world in which none of those corporations existed, right, how much would professional basketball players, quarterbacks in the NFL and soccer players in the EPL actually get paid? If there weren't these, if Manchester United was just a grouping of people, not a legal organisation with huge legal power, if it was just a group of people playing soccer on a Saturday and other days, how much wealth would it actually generate and contain within itself? So it may be that we could actually live with all of Nozick's arguments and with the inequality that it would generate if we did so consistently and accepted that we have to live in a state with no corporations, where the corporation had to be abolished. Okay, but there's no recognition of this in Nozick. There's no recognition of the fact that the corporation is a creation that has to be justified in exactly the same way as everything else has to be justified. He just assumes that when we go into the minimal state, corporations will be there, but there's no argument for that. He doesn't present any argument for that. The creation of a corporation, corporations can't be arrived at on the basis of Pareto efficient transactions. Corporations can only be arrived at on the basis of intervention in the free market by the law in some way, whether that's by judge-made law or by legislation. And on the face of it, that can't be justified on Nozick's position. So I think that my own view about this is that Nozick may well actually justify, the Wilt Chamberlain argument might work, but it might not justify anything like the level of inequality that Nozick thinks it would justify, because the level of inequality that we are imagining Nozick, Wilt having, is a level of inequality of a kind that exists in societies that have corporations. And of course, the thing about corporations is that they are conglomerations of power and wealth. And on the face of it, these things can't exist in Nozick's minimal state. So there's a blindness there in Nozick's argument. And all the philosophers that we've looked at, including me, of course, have these blindnesses. So in Locke's major blindness was that he didn't understand that people might have different views about morality. Remember, he just didn't understand that. He didn't see that. He thought if it's written in scripture, it's all very clear. No one could dispute that. But that's just a blindness. Of course people can dispute what's written in scripture. They do it all the time. But Bentham, what was his blindness? He thought that once people were in government, you could trust them to put aside their self-interest. And we don't think that now. We think that's a very odd view. Mill had this blindness that he thought that we could just identify what harm was without any difficulty, but it was not like that. It's much more difficult to identify harm than Mill thought. Marx was completely blind to the role of the state, or almost completely blind to the role of the state in propping up capitalism. He had almost nothing to say about that whatsoever. It's just extraordinary when you think about what's happened since Marx was writing. Rawls seems to be blind to the amount of coercion that his system is going to require in order to maintain the difference principle. And Nozick's blind to the fact that corporations can't be justified under his own system. He just thinks that they will exist under the minimal state without providing any justification for their existence. They can't. Corporations are much more than voluntary gatherings of people, right? They have an ability to act legally that's way in excess of what, for example, a partnership, which is itself a legal creation, can have. Okay, so in what sense then does Nozick actually justify what we today understand by a free market? See, when people today talk about the free market, they're talking about a market that is completely dominated by corporations. So I don't think Nozick justifies that at all, because he can't justify the existence of corporations in the first place. Okay. All right, so that's my Marxian criticism of Nozick, that he actually doesn't justify what he thinks he justifies. He justifies a state in which there is no redistribution, sure, in which there is no government spending on large government infrastructure projects and so on, sure. He justifies a state in which the government only has a police power, so there are police and defence and so on, but very little else, sure, I agree with all of that, but what he doesn't see is he also rules out the existence of the corporation. His argument rules out the existence of the corporation, so he's arguing for a very different society than the one we live in. It may be a better one than what we live in. It's just not the one that he thought that he was arguing for. Okay, that brings to an end our discussion of Nozick. What I want to do next is to try and bring all the threads that we've looked at in this course together.